They called him a fake Marine and laughed when he quietly sipped his beer at the corner table, wearing an old service jacket with faded patches. The bar patrons who mocked his costume had no idea they were insulting a decorated war hero whose entire battalion was about to walk through that door. Welcome to Stories from Us. Before we begin this powerful story of brotherhood and military honor, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments matter more than you know. Thomas "Tommy" Anderson sat at the same corner table every Friday night at Murphy's Bar, nursing a single beer and quietly remembering friends who didn't make it home from places most people had never heard of. At 67 years old, with gray hair and posture that still reflected decades of military bearing, Tommy often wore pieces of his old Marine uniform, sometimes his faded utility jacket, sometimes his dress blue cover, always with the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem displayed with the kind of pride that comes from earning the right to wear it. Murphy's Bar was a small-town establishment where regulars knew each other's names and stories, but Tommy had kept to himself for the 3 years he'd been coming there. He would order his beer, sit quietly in his corner, and sometimes stare into the distance with the expression of someone carrying memories that were too heavy to share. The other patrons were curious about him, but most had developed theories about the quiet old man that ranged from skeptical to openly dismissive. A group of younger men in their 20s and 30s, Brad Wilson, Mike Stevens, Steve Martinez, and Danny Clark, were particularly vocal in their doubts about Tommy's military background. None of them had served in the military themselves, but they considered themselves experts on what real Marines looked and acted like, and Tommy didn't fit their preconceived notions. "That old guy really thinks he's fooling people with that Marine act," Brad would whisper loudly enough for his friends to hear. "Look at that uniform. Probably bought it at a surplus store." "I bet he's never been within 100 miles of a military base," Mike would add with a smirk. "Real Marines don't sit around bars looking sad and pathetic." "Probably some wannabe who watched too many war movies and decided to play dress-up," Steve would contribute, triggering nods of agreement from the group. These conversations had been going on for weeks, growing bolder and more disrespectful as the young men convinced themselves that they were calling out a fraud who was dishonoring the memory of real veterans. Tommy heard every word, but he never responded, never defended himself, never tried to prove his credentials. He simply continued drinking his beer and maintaining the dignified silence that had become his refuge from a world that seemed increasingly hostile to the values he had spent his life defending. What none of the bar patrons knew, what Tommy had never shared with anyone in his civilian life, was that Staff Sergeant Thomas Anderson had served 20 years in the United States Marine Corps from 1975 to 1995, participating in some of the most dangerous and significant military operations of the late 20th century. He had been deployed to Lebanon during the peacekeeping mission that ended in tragedy at the Marine barracks bombing. He had served in Grenada during Operation Urgent Fury. He had fought in the Persian Gulf War as part of the ground assault that liberated Kuwait. More than just serving in these conflicts, Tommy had distinguished himself as a leader and a warrior. He had earned 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, a Bronze Star with V device for valor in the face of enemy fire, and a Combat Action Ribbon that represented direct engagement with hostile forces. His service record included commendations for life-saving actions under fire, leadership excellence in combat conditions, and the kind of dedication to his fellow Marines that had made him legendary within his unit. But military service had taken its toll in ways that weren't visible to casual observers. PTSD from repeated exposure to combat trauma, survivor's guilt from losing too many friends, and the challenge of adjusting to civilian life after 2 decades of military structure had left Tommy isolated and struggling with demons that he carried alone. The bar had become his weekly ritual of remembrance, a place where he could sit quietly and honor the memory of Marines who had given everything for their country and their brothers. The confrontation that would change everything began on a Friday night in November when Brad and his friends had consumed enough alcohol to feel emboldened beyond their usual whispered mockery. Tommy was wearing his utility jacket with faded patches and his dress blue cover, sitting at his regular table with a beer that he'd been nursing for over an hour. "Hey, old man," Brad called out loudly enough for the entire bar to hear. "Where'd you get that costume?" "The local theater's prop department?" Tommy looked up but didn't respond, hoping that silence would discourage further interaction. "I bet you never served a day in your life," Mike added, emboldened by Brad's aggression. "Just another stolen valor case trying to get respect you never earned." "Probably too much of a coward to actually join the military," Steve contributed with a laugh that carried more cruelty than humor. The other patrons in the bar began paying attention to the confrontation, some looking uncomfortable with the direction the evening was taking. The bartender, Mike Sullivan, started moving closer to the situation, recognizing that intervention might be necessary. "Prove it," Brad demanded, standing up and approaching Tommy's table with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "If you're such a tough Marine, show us your credentials." Tommy remained calm, but reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn military ID card, placing it gently on the table. "Staff Sergeant Thomas Anderson, United States Marine Corps, 20 years of service, 1975 to 1995. Brad grabbed the ID and examined it with exaggerated skepticism. "This could be fake. Anyone can get these made on the internet these days." "Yeah, right," Mike laughed. "Old man trying to impress us with a prop ID." Tommy took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tension that came when his honor and service were questioned. "Gentlemen, I served my country for 2 decades. I don't need to prove anything to you." "Bullshit!" Brad shouted, his voice carrying across the bar. "Fake Marine! Stolen valor! You're dishonoring real veterans!" The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. For Tommy, being accused of stolen valor was one of the most insulting charges that could be leveled against any veteran, suggesting that he was fraudulently claiming credit for sacrifices made by genuine heroes. Just as the situation seemed about to escalate into something potentially violent, the front door of Murphy's Bar opened at exactly 8:30 p.m. Gunnery Sergeant Mike Rodriguez entered first, wearing his dress blue uniform with ribbons and decorations that reflected years of distinguished service. He was followed by Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez, then Master Sergeant James Patterson, then Lance Corporal Kevin Murphy. One by one, Marines in various uniforms began filling the bar, each looking around until they spotted Tommy Anderson sitting at his corner table. "Staff Sergeant Anderson," Rodriguez called out with genuine joy and respect. "There you are, sir. We've been looking everywhere for you." "Tommy!" Gonzalez shouted with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a beloved family member. "The reunion isn't the same without you." Within minutes, Murphy's Bar was filled with approximately 40 Marines representing different ages, ranks, and eras of service, but all united by one common bond. They had all served under or alongside Staff Sergeant Thomas Anderson, and they had come to honor him. Brad and his friends stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. This couldn't be real. The man they had been mocking as a fake couldn't possibly command this kind of respect from this many genuine Marines. "Sir," Rodriguez said, addressing Tommy with the formal respect due to a superior NCO, "when you didn't show up at the regimental reunion, we decided to come get you. You know we can't celebrate without our favorite staff sergeant." "You taught half of us everything we know about being Marines," Patterson added, "from boot camp training to combat leadership in the Gulf War." Tommy's eyes filled with tears as he looked around at the faces of men and women he had trained, led, and in some cases saved during their years of service together. For the first time in months, he felt the warmth of brotherhood that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his military career. "Marines," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't sure if I should come to the reunion. I didn't know if anyone would remember an old NCO who's been out of the Corps for over 20 years. "Are you kidding?" Master Sergeant Lisa Chen said, stepping forward to embrace her former instructor. "Half of us owe our lives to you. Remember Beirut in '83? Desert Storm in '91? You were the NCO who taught us how to bring everyone home." Brad's mouth hung open as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Tommy wasn't just a veteran, he was clearly a revered leader who had earned the lasting respect and gratitude of multiple generations of Marines. "Tommy," Gonzalez said, "tell them about Operation Desert Storm. How you led our squad through that minefield when our officer got wounded." "Or Beirut," Rodriguez added, "when you carried Corporal Williams under fire for half a mile after the barracks bombing." Tommy raised his hand to quiet the stories. "That's enough, Marines. Those are old operations, and we were all just doing our jobs." But the Marines weren't finished. One by one, they began sharing stories of Tommy's leadership, courage, and dedication. Stories of a staff sergeant who had consistently put the welfare of his Marines ahead of his own safety, who had trained them not just to be effective warriors, but to be the kind of leaders who brought everyone home. Rodriguez turned to Brad and his friends, who had been standing in stunned silence throughout the reunion. "You gentlemen friends of Staff Sergeant Anderson?" Brad stammered, unable to form a coherent response. We were just—" "Because if you are," Patterson interjected, "you should know you're talking to a legend. This man saved more Marines than anyone else in our regiment. 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star with V device for valor, combat action ribbon, and the respect of every Marine who ever served under him." "Sir," said Corporal Sarah Davis, one of the younger Marines who had been trained by Tommy during his final years of service, "would you honor us by joining the reunion? The entire battalion is waiting, and we want to present you with something special." Tommy stood slowly, his bearing straightening as he was surrounded by the Marines who represented the best years of his life. "Of course, Marines. Let's go honor our fallen brothers and celebrate the Corps that made us who we are." The entire group of Marines formed up around Tommy, creating an honor guard that escorted him toward the door. As they passed Brad's table, Tommy stopped and looked directly at the young man who had questioned his service. "Son," Tommy said quietly, "respect is earned through service and sacrifice, not demanded through confrontation. Maybe someday you'll understand the difference between honoring those who served and attacking those you don't understand." The Marines escorted Tommy out of Murphy's bar with a dignity and ceremony that transformed the evening from a confrontation into a celebration of military brotherhood. Brad and his friends remained at their table, speechless and ashamed, finally understanding the magnitude of their disrespect. Bartender Mike Sullivan approached their table after the Marines had left. "You know, boys, Tommy's been coming here for 3 years. Never caused trouble, never bragged about his service, just sat quietly drinking his beer and remembering friends who didn't make it home. Real heroes don't need to prove themselves to anyone. They've already proven everything that matters when it counted." Brad hung his head in shame. "We were wrong. We were completely wrong." "Yes, you were," Sullivan replied. "That man fought for your right to sit here and question his service. Lucky for you, he's got more class and dignity than you showed him tonight." From that evening forward, Tommy never came to Murphy's bar alone. Every Friday night he would arrive with a group of Marine veterans, sharing stories, honoring fallen comrades, and maintaining the bonds that had sustained them through decades of service. Brad and his friends learned to stand when Tommy entered, to nod respectfully, and to remember that true heroism often comes in quiet packages that don't need to announce themselves. Because real Marines don't need to prove they're Marines. They've already proven everything that matters in places where proof meant the difference between life and death, in moments when their brothers' lives depended on their courage, training, and dedication to the Corps and to each other. Thomas Anderson never needed a uniform to be a Marine, never needed recognition to know his worth, and never needed to prove his service to strangers who had never earned the right to question it. He found meaning in the brotherhood itself, the bonds forged in training and strengthened in combat, the shared understanding that comes from serving something larger than yourself. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about what people do when everyone's watching. They're about how they carry themselves when they're alone, how they respond to disrespect, and how they maintain their dignity in the face of ignorance. They're about the quiet heroes who walk among us, carrying the weight of service and sacrifice without demanding recognition or thanks. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Thomas Anderson? Someone who served quietly, carried their sacrifices with dignity, and was defended by the brothers and sisters who knew their true worth? Share their name in the comments. Tell us how they taught you about real heroism, military brotherhood, and the difference between earning respect and demanding it. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to help us honor the quiet heroes and military brotherhood that deserve to be remembered. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, the next time you see someone sitting quietly, carrying themselves with dignity despite the world's indifference, think twice before judging their story. You might be looking at a hero,